Thomas Green here with Ethical Marketing Service. On the podcast today, we have Lyn Lindbergh. Lyn, welcome.
Oh, thanks, Tom. Nice to be here.
It's nice to have you. Would you like to take a moment and tell the audience a bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure. I'm Lyn Lindbergh, and I founded a little tiny company called Shop, and it's really laser focused on teaching the very basics of how to listen, all the things we think we already know, but really have a hard time practicing. And so we help you get there.
Well, I think that this is perhaps a skill, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a skill which people seldom have. So it's quite rare to have a good listener. Would you say that's accurate?
Yes, I would say people who are good listeners are only good listeners when they seek out to be a good listener, or if they're raised in a home that was a bunch of good listeners. I mean, I was one of those just really unique kids where I grew up in a home with my parents, my mom especially, were really, really good listeners. And I did not know that that was unusual. I did not know that most people weren't raised that way. And so when I got into my 20s and was out, in the real world, I was so frustrated by how people would not listen and talk over each other. And part of it was because when you don't have that balance, then you don't feel like you have your own voice, and everyone wants to have their own voice and be heard. But also because I realized in my 40s that because I was a listener, it was incredibly powerful, and I learned so much about people that you I didn't know that people shared things with me that they didn't share with anybody else simply because I was a listener.
Mm.
Until one day I was hanging out with my now husband, and he said, "Oh my gosh, people tell you things. The waitress, the clerk at the grocery store, like everybody." He's like, "This is really weird." And I was like, "What do you mean? Don't doesn't everybody in the world have these kind of conversations?" And he's like, no, I never heard a waitress tell me all about how she's going through divorce and looking for a new home before. Like, never, you know." Um, and we can talk a little bit more too about how in business listening is incredibly powerful too. So yeah. So no, people really, it's hard. It's a skill you have to practice. It's a skill I have to practice every day.
So, for those that perhaps are unaware about the benefits, what's the outcome for someone who, let's say, they spent time and effort learning to be a better listener? What would that give them?
It would give them this great world of being able to see more around them. They would have more empathy for the people around them. They would have closer connections with friends. And this isn't listening in that concept of, never say anything yourself and let people walk all over you. I think that's a mistake sometimes people make. It's more of a really empowering, make a real strong connection with someone. For example, I was a consultant. Actually, I still am, but was full-time consultant for Fortune 500 companies for 10 years. And one of my clients directly told me, she said, um, when she signed the contract to work with our company, she said, "I will sign this contract as long as you manage it because I trust you." And so when you listen to someone and they feel heard and they feel like you get them and you understand them, or they trust that if you don't fully understand them, you will take the time to, then there's that trust. And they're like, "Yeah, I want to work with Lyn because she's going to be there for me and she's going to advocate for my needs." And that resulted in sales and bigger contracts and longer people more willing to sign a long-term contract, which is amazing. Yeah. So that's a business side of it. I could talk about teenagers, but one step at a
Well,
time.
I was going to say, I suppose if you're in a business with other human beings, I would imagine it would be extremely beneficial. If you're in like an e-commerce business where there's not actually much interaction, then these skills, I think, in your personal life are still going to be extremely valuable. So it's one of those things which self-development wise, I kind of feel like listening and listening skills have a bit of a marketing problem because it's a really important skill. Not many people are talking about it. Any thoughts on that?
I think you're absolutely right. Because when when we're in school, we're taught, sit down and listen, right? So we kind of have this assumption that by the time we're done with school and we're in the real world, that this assumption that listening is just like passively having information come in your ears. And I think you're right that in business a lot of times because it is true if you are vibrant and you have the energy and the confidence and you can speak eloquently, it is true that is a very, very powerful tool. And so that's why I think businesses focus so much on that, the powerful presentations. But the listening is a harder piece to integrate in. So yeah, do they have a marketing issue? Absolutely. What do we do about it? I'm not sure.
Well, I think in terms of what we do about that, I think you are doing something about that. So I would
Mhm.
say you are in the minority of people who are actually highlighting the importance of listening skills.
Mhm. Well, and it's interesting because people are Googling or searching on the internet for listening skills, because the inception of this business was actually not something I was looking out for at all. It was, I have a son in high school in the United States here. And one of the things that we can do is kids can do a work study mentorship under someone, learn a real world skill, and then it can apply towards some of their school credits. And so he said, "Oh, well, my mom's a podcaster. I'll learn podcasting and I'll learn her technology." And so I thought, okay, great, awesome. So he was going to do a podcast. We started teaching him everything. And then when it came for the time for him to actually record something, he said, like a good teenager, "I don't want to do this anymore. This is dumb. Why did you make me do this, mom?" And so I turned on my listening skills, right? And just asked him to tell me more, leaned in, great eye contact, slow things down, go at his pace. And in listening, I discovered he actually didn't think the project was dumb. The fact that he said he didn't want to do it, don't take a teenager for face value 9 times out of 10, right? It was he wasn't ready to record his own voice and have it out there in the public. So at that moment, we decided that we would come up with a topic, record the, 12 or 14 episodes, and then he would still do all the production work. So that's where listening skills came from, because we had this like, oh my gosh, hey, what are we going to do? What are we going to record on? We got to make something up. And this launched almost a year ago. We've done no advertising for it, and it still gets like 100 downloads every single day, which is crazy for a podcast that's a
Mm.
year old to still be getting all kinds of downloads. Yeah.
Well, there's a demand then for it, for what you do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. There's a demand, and it's a term people are searching. So yeah, it's kind of a crazy way that it started. So
Good. In terms of the difference between what you do and what I've heard before, what's your take on active listening, and is that different from what you advocate?
I would say what this is actually is pretty much the very, very basics of active listening. It's the eye contact, it's the, body language, it's leaning in, looking towards the person you're talking to. Um, and but it's, I would say, even more simple than active listening. It's just the very basics. And then the guide, because my degree and background's in education, and so I'm asking myself the question, okay, if technically we already know what these skills are, technically, if everybody can kind of list off probably half of the basic listening skills, even if you're a terrible listener, what's the gap? Why is the behavior not matching? Why is the listening not happening when we kind of already know, it's that same thing of if we know how to eat and exercise, why don't we eat and exercise in the right way, right? What's that gap? And that's really what that next piece of what we look to solve. And so we created a guide using just my degree and background in education and how adult brains learn. And I have another book on a different topic that's actually won a bunch of awards, and it's about behavior change. Um, and it's like simple, 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 simple. Here's the first concept: eye contact. Okay, now let's go and practice eye contact. Now let's evaluate ourselves and our ability to do eye contact. Now let's observe other conversations and see how that conversation that we're observing at the coffee shop or at the pub, how would that conversation be better or worse if the eye contact was different? And we do that with all 10 skills. And by the end, it kind of wrecks you because you start analyzing everybody's conversations around you. um, but you're able to just actually really internalize it and see and practice. And then that's where the life change comes. So to your question, Thomas, about how is this different from active listening skills? Not so much. What's different is it's just so simple and so laser focused, that hopefully the hope is that it actually creates change in people's lives.
Well, I think in terms of being able to achieve a goal, which is to be a better listener, breaking it down, micro goals, going to be the best way to start, right? So
Exactly.
I've heard many times about people who they practice the concept of I'm just going to wait for my next turn to talk, and I'm not actually going to take in anything what you're saying. Any thoughts there that spring to mind?
Yes, that's a really good point. That concept of they're talking, but I'm formulating what I want to say. And what I have to say is probably really important. But if I focus on what the other person is saying, I might forget what I have to say. And that's just not where I want to go. So, yeah, so we actually teach in like, I don't know, lesson 107 or 108, I don't know. But basically, when you listen to the other person talking, you want to not interrupt. And of course, let me pause here and say, of course, this is context. And of course, nothing in the world ever applies to everything. So we just kind of ramp it up to make it really easy to see, and then you apply it the best you can in the real world. But when we're sitting across the table from somebody, hypothetically, we don't interrupt until they finish a thought. And so that could be one word, that could be 5 minutes, 10 minutes. But unless we're doing like a quick little clarifying piece, we don't interrupt till they finish a thought. And then when it's our turn to talk, we don't go into those thoughts we have banked in our head. Instead, we first reiterate and clarify to make sure we understand what they said. And makes conversations go a lot longer, but in a way, it's way more efficient if people feel understood and heard. And this works surprisingly well in high conflict situations because you can say, I have a couple of incredibly high conflict um, customers in the past and high conflict relationships in my life that just can't go away I mean, we all have that, right? Life is messy. And I found that that piece of now I want to say what I want to say, and everyone's saying what they want to say, but nobody's actually listening, is a beautiful magic way to drive through that is to say, okay, and I've even done this with narcissists before, and it actually works. To say, okay, I really want to hear what you're saying. I want you to feel understood. So I will sit and listen to you and clarify until you say, yes, you understand me. If you do the same for me. And here's the crazy thing, the person on the other side of the table, even if it's high conflict, they will probably say, yes, I will listen to you in return because they don't want to be the jerk that says, no, I want to talk and I won't listen, right? Because at our core, we have that. And so that tends to work well if you get to that point where it's like no, no, but then it's like, okay, then you quickly identify like this conversation is not going to, we need to take a breather, step away, come back later. But yeah, so you clarify and then you can share your piece. Um, what I get though is that like, what do you do when you have somebody who just won't stop talking, right? You don't have anybody like that in your life, right? Somebody who's just like blah, 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 and they just blue streak. This is one tiny pro tip I teach, and only because it's been really super effective in my life is, and this is not listening. This is not a listening thing, but it's a question that comes up, right? Because is if there's somebody who's notorious about never stopping talking. I'm trying to come up with nice non-profane words to say about them, Interrupt them. That's the one time. Just mid-sentence, interrupt them nicely and move on, and they won't even notice. Because if somebody talks nonstop, when you their entire life, everybody in their life has to interrupt them in order to get a word in edgewise. So that person who talks nonstop has a skewed sense of reality of that's just how it works. People interrupt each other. So you actually can interrupt them with your thought. 9 times out of 10, they'll jump right on with you and they won't even realize that you rudely interrupted them because they just think that's how conversations work. So it's a short-term strategy, not part of the long-term goal, but that question always comes up. But they're like, but what about, Aunt Becky at Thanksgiving? What do I do? Or excuse me, that's an American holiday, but you know what I mean.
Any theories on why people become like that?
No. How about you? How about you, Thomas? What do you think?
I think you touched on something which was upbringing. So let's say, I mean, I wouldn't attempt to identify the exact reason, but like if you were in a family with, I don't know, 8 siblings or something, and the only way you could get a word in was by continually talking and making sure that you were the loudest person, and if you were brought up like that, then I can imagine how that would turn into that behavior.
Yeah. You know what? I think I haven't done my research on that, but it completely makes sense because I think about how I grew up. It was not perfect by any means, but I grew up in that era of that real traditional. We sat down as a family of 5 every single night for dinner. Every kid had their turn to share what happened during the day, and it wasn't it it felt good. It was just a normal thing we did. It's Aaron's turn to talk. Now it's Sherry's turn to talk. And you just, you know, um, it worked out great. So that's how I was raised. And I think it's good and bad in both ways, right? If you're raised going in and getting your way and, bulldozing, there's good and bad to that. And if you were like me, raised polarized on the other side of just always listening and never having to learn how to push through. Sometimes you have to push through to get your voice heard. Um, then I had to work through how to advocate for myself and how to be heard. And presentation skills was something I had to work on. But
Well,
listening, man, I had that. Go ahead.
The next time that you get one of those people that doesn't stop talking and you have to interrupt them, it can be our inside joke where you can just say, "Did you have 8 siblings?"
Okay, that is beautiful. That is beautiful. Well, and then you got the other end of the spectrum of what do you do when you really need information out of someone or you really want more information, but they just don't talk or they give you, and this is the whole teenage example, which absolutely applies to all relationships. And it the concept is to take the last word or two of the speaker if they're not speaking as much or if you want more, and if you want more detail without seeming like you're probing too hard, take the last word or two that they said, give a long just give a long pause with the body language that says you're listening. They cannot help themselves. They will tell you more. I mean, so the classic example is the kid who comes home from school. And this is a real example from our lives. Teenager comes home from school. Hey, honey, how was school? Fine. Fine? Well, it's kind of dumb. Kind of dumb? Yeah, well, we got this math assignment and the teacher, blah, 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 da 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 da, and you can go down and just get so much more information. So that works with everybody, but you have to be willing. Grab the last word or two, long awkward pause, and they'll just fill in the space for you. Usually, it's amazing. And when we put this listening skills project together, my son and I, we worked together on it, and then the whole family learned about this, and it became kind of top of mind in the family, which let me tell you is super awesome for the family to have the listening skills vocabulary. And so we would start doing this to each other, this repeating the last word or two, and it became a joke in the family. And we're like, "Ha, I did it again! I got you to talk!" And
But it does
yeah,
also kind of tell them that, I want to know more. I want to hear more about what your day
yep,
was. And
yep,
yeah, I kind of
yeah.
like it. I think there are an awful lot of parents that might need that information.
It's the of all the things I talk about, that's the number one thing people come back and say, "Wow, that was life changing." And I was on an interview a few weeks ago, and the gentleman, it was like a brewery and bros kind of podcast of teaching young men how to be more men, and I did that to him, and I just started repeating the last word, and then after about 2 minutes, he said, wow, he had no idea this was going on. He's like, wow, we just ended up way down a rabbit hole. Like, I'm not sure how we got there. And I was like, because I did it to you. It's like, everybody rewind the tape and you will hear I just did that to him. And it was made my day.
Well, you touched on something there which I wanted to ask you about, which
Yeah.
was you are, going on as a podcast guest, speaking to people, and the format is talking. So presumably,
Sorry, yes.
you're having some instances, I'm guessing, where people aren't listening all that well. So what's that dynamic like? What's that like for you?
When I'm talking on a podcast
Well,
and
you are advocating better listening, and yet
yep.
perhaps the person who is talking is maybe not listening that well.
Oh, gotcha. Gotcha. Well, here's the funny thing. When you talk about listening skills, when I talk about listening skills and it's top of mind in an actual interview about listening skills, I've never had that happen. And the reason is because it's upfront, top of mind. And I believe my hypothesis is that it is testament to the fact that people actually want to be better listeners. And so when we're thinking about it, we do want to do it. And in that moment, when it's in our conscious mind of, I want to be a better listener, we actually can be better listeners. Now, 5 minutes later, it might go out the window. But even in our family, when this project was going on, we were way better listeners. And now it ebbs and flows, and we remind each other. When I had friends over at my house and talked about the project, The second you start talking, and it's a funny thing, the second you start talking about listening skills, all of a sudden, like their eye contact gets better, their posture gets better, like that you kind of know, you just have to be reminded. Um, so it's really the hard work is just day to day when you're just interacting with somebody who doesn't have this top of mind, isn't thinking about it, and it's not necessarily an appropriate context to be able to say, oh, hey, by the way, you really should listen to this podcast and brush up on your listening skills, you know?
I didn't expect you to say that. I thought that there would be maybe some people who not that self-aware, but I mean that's good. That's a positive thing if people are that way inclined.
I had one person not podcast who was going to business school who interviewed me. And this particular person I knew who was one of those never stops talking personalities. Somebody I knew, maybe in my family, will leave them nameless. And they, even in the conversation, they were saying, they would stop themselves and say, oh my gosh, this is so hard. We're talking about listening and I'm doing all the talking. And that, I mean, that happened multiple times. So there's an example of someone who is just the one who talks a blue streak over everyone. And they got themselves to a place of frustration because it was so hard to do the listening. But they were committing to changing. I think the hard parts are when you get to, you know, an event or a group or a business situation where there's a lot of big egos and the majority of people haven't brushed up on listening skills. And then it's like, you know, that's where you just kind of hope that they can get to those listening skills again someday. Because we definitely, as you mentioned, Thomas, we are nowhere near that tipping point of having the majority of us being able to listen at all.
Well, what you brought up kind of makes me think about what, you know, your business and how maybe a part of the selling point is actually to be present so that people are reminded about the fact that they need to keep it top of mind. Do you do any of that?
Mm-hmm. Tell me a little bit more about keeping it present and top of mind.
So, in the instance where you're talking to people and that listening skills are top of mind for them, therefore they do it well. And if you're helping people with listening, part of a selling point for you, presumably, is that if they want to be better listeners, which most people do, they need to continually have you have your services because in order to do that, they're going to be better listeners.
Okay, that's brilliant. I need to write that down. Because when you go back to the inception of the whole business, that's actually really brilliant. You go back to the inception of the business and where it came from. Originally, the business plan was that we set it up academic, like here's our listening skills 101, the basic skills. And then at the end of that, you'll hear me say, oh, and coming soon, list 202 and 303, more advanced skills. And then I quickly realized that these basic skills are so foundational, so powerful, and we need reminded over and over and over that we abandoned the advanced skills because we're like exactly what you just said, but I'd never put it. Thank you. I'd never put it in those words before that you just need to refresh. So I'm going to think about that and yeah, and still like because you got to come back and refresh. Yeah. So no, I hadn't thought about that before. Thank you.
No worries.
You might have just saved my business.
That's what podcasts are supposed to be about, right? So,
Exactly.
In terms of what those foundational skills are, and let's say someone wants to go ahead and implement something to make them a better listener, what would you recommend as the first few steps?
Oh, just head over to listeningskills.shop, and it's a .shop URL, not a .com, just listeningskills.shop. It's super simple web page. It's just one page, and right up front there is the podcast episodes. There's think 14 of them. They're 3 to 4 minutes each. So you could, like right now while I'm talking, you could go to listeningskills.shop, or you can, any podcast player, you'll see it there, and just start listening to those. They're free like any other podcast. And then if you want to practice and dial in, there is a workbook that we mentioned before that'll help you dial it in. But yeah, in within a half hour from right now, you could be brushed up on your basic listening skills.
Any misconceptions about the topic?
That's a great question. And I touched on it earlier, but I would like to ask you, actually. I'd like to do some listening. What do you see as some misconceptions about listening?
I suppose it depends on the context. If we're speaking business wise, I would suspect that the misconception would be that it's a skill which would be nice to have, but is not vital to have, not mandatory to have. And so an example of that would be, for example, I do a lot of marketing, advertising related. You can see a clear ROI on that activity. But because listening skills is a little harder to quantify, you can't directly say, here is the effort I've put in and here's what I've gotten back. But I think that because of the things we've discussed today, and especially if you're in a person-to-person business, I think it's bound to be something that would be beneficial for you.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and Thomas, that's actually really interesting about the ROI and the numbers, because it is, listening skills is a soft skill, right? So it's just almost impossible to quantify. You know, lagging indicators of all of that and how it all works together. However, I would say if we think about business and think about teams and what causes the most frustration in work day to day, and if somebody's frustrated with their manager, I would say most of the time people's frustration with management or, VP or executive levels is they feel like their manager or the VP doesn't get it or they don't understand. And that comes down to listening. And really there's so much power if you're thinking about motivating teams and motivating people. We are way more motivated to work hard for somebody that we feel understands us and we can trust them, and that trust is built by listening. And we could take it even further and just think about just all the struggles in 2020 and COVID and feeling, just being in lockdown, for lack of a better word. And it's just, I think a lot of people just felt so alone and felt like there was nobody there to hear them and they had no voice. And really feeling like you have a voice is so powerful and so energizing in a way. So yeah, I think listening is an amazing thing. I think execs make the mistake all the time of feeling like they're too busy to listen. And I've managed big corporate projects with teams of 100 and more. And one of the things I always did as much as humanly possible was listening. And there's something magic about doing that one-on-one, small groups, that maybe there's no action items that come out of it. Maybe nothing changes, but the loyalty of the people that I listen to just skyrockets every time. So it's definitely an activity worth doing.
People like to be heard, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, they do.
Well, I have found it very calming. You're a very calming person to speak to. Have you gotten that feedback?
Yes. Yes, I have. I get feedback about my voice specifically. And, I've come to a place in my life, you could say I'm middle age, which I don't think I am. I'll be 37 forever, even though I'm way older than that. Um, that's just a silly side joke because I literally have birthday candles that say 37 and I'm actually 48, but I still use my 37 birthday candles. Yeah, that's just a whole random side thing. But I think I've come to a place in my life where I realize that I'm not always this mellow and calm. I'm also can be a little crazy and fun and wacky. Um, but I've learned that slowing down and really listening or being focused is has been an incredible tool for me. I've even got a sticky note on my monitor right here that says center your mind and put your hands and then put your hands on the keyboard. And just been so powerful. I could get in front of my computer and I first pause, close my eyes, center my mind. I'm like, okay, what am I really doing here? What's going on? What's important? Okay, now I'm ready to go. And part of the reason is, okay, this is, you okay with a little bit of a tangent for business? Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Is part of it is I spent 20 years in corporate as a consultant working for high pressure, big stakes, stressed out, working 80 hours a week jobs. And I was, that type A can do. I mean, look at me listening skills. I just we built that last summer just on a whim. And it's, here it is. I mean, that's just kind of who I am. And about 5 years ago, my health fell apart because I'd worked too hard. And I was diagnosed with three different things, one of them being fibromyalgia. And so I had about a year where I essentially couldn't really do anything. And I know it was my body telling me, Lynn, you got to slow down. You got to take your stress levels down. And so that has just in the last 5 years been really transformational for me to help me manage, really dive in. How do I manage stress? How do I, stay high performing, because you don't want to let go of that. How do I stay high performing and still not wreck my body in the process, or die a young death. And so that's been really, really good for me in my old age.
Well, I'm glad that you've been able to sustain performance and kind of go towards that Zen approach.
Mm-hmm.
Makes me happy.
Oh, yeah, you seem fairly Zen yourself, Thomas.
Well, I don't know. I guess it's just natural. So I at least like to think that I'm a good listener, whether or not that's the case or not.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe I need to listen to your podcast a little bit and then double check whether that's the case. But
Yeah.
given the fact that you are, let's say, more mellow now, what are your goals?
My goals are, well, with listening skills, the book is electronic, and I'm in the process of getting that put out in a print version. So we've got drafts we're working on with that. And then the podcast actually talks about the 200 and 300 level courses, which I have abandoned. So I need to update that. But really, the more I can just reach out to groups and communities and help them just relook at this, the better. And then, yeah, I think my life goals are pretty simple as far as just, yep, staying centered, loving family, loving kids, loving friends, and staying healthy, because having your health is a huge, huge enabler.
Underrated, isn't it, health?
It is until you start approaching 50, and then all of a sudden it's like top of mind. But yeah. I remember being in my 20s and hearing people my age talk about health issues and reading glasses and thinking, oh, that's just what, old people are just complaining. And now here I am. But yeah, health is huge. And I do have another business called Couch to Active. That's all about helping people with chronic illnesses gain a healthy lifestyle. So that's another gig that I work on.
You're an overachiever, I think. Did you say that's true?
To a fault. Yep. That's part of my therapy. It's I'm always Okay. Here's a bit of advice for all the overachievers out there who, you always have 1,000 ideas and you can only execute on a certain number of them. Somewhere I learned that in order to be an overachiever, when you have too many ideas and not enough hours in the day, and you're not about to go hire a whole staff to do it for you, right? Especially solopreneurs, is to realize that if you live a life of just doing what you can every day and some things fall off the plate, that's kind of a reactive, you're out of control, you're not choosing what falls off the plate. And I think part of the overachiever is we really struggle. We don't want anything to fall off the plate. But I realize that if I look at my plate and say, okay, 12 of these 14 things are going to fall off the plate, I need to choose what two I want to stay on the plate and make that choice. The others will fall off the plate. That's actually what got listening skills going, and that's what got my other business, Couched Active, going. Is it's like, okay, this is great. I have this other idea for 3 other books I want to write, but you know what? If I start writing 3 books while I'm doing listening skills, I'm not going to get any of them done. And so, yeah, there's another tangent for you.
Good advice. Is there anything which you think that would be worthwhile mentioning that I haven't asked you about today?
I would just say when it comes to listening and learning to listen, it's a lifelong practice. And share with your friends that you're doing this. Explicitly tell people in your life, hey, I'm working on being a better listener. And you could say, like, hey, I listen to these podcasts and I'm working on becoming a better listener. Do that and share that with anybody and everybody. And you will find just saying that in that moment, the person in the room with you will be like, yeah, nobody else can listen. Nobody listens. And in that moment, they might try to listen to you better. And in that moment, you might be able to share something you've been wanting to share, and they might be in a space where they can actually hear you.
Again, great advice. I really also like the if there is someone who doesn't speak that much and you're in a position where you're open to listening and yet you're not getting much back. Your strategy for that was great. I'm going to have to try that one. So,
Yeah.
Lyn, where's the best place for people to find you?
Oh, just head on over to listeningskills.shop. You could also Google my name, Lyn Lindbergh, and I come up all over the place.
Well, thank you very much for all the value today.
Oh, thank you. It was an honor and a pleasure to meet you.